welcome to this session on integrating carbon management into the delivery of infrastructure and buildings. I think perhaps we might have got more people if we just called it the PAS 2080 A-Team, because that really is what we have here. And PAS 2080 is absolutely central to achieving net zero across the built environment. So it sits above kind of everything in this whole place. So that's what we're going to be discussing. We're going to be covering some headlines, some very important parts of PAS 2080 and how it applies to the supply chain and everyone in this room. So we'll sort of see who you're representing, not the individual organizations, but sort of whether you're a client, designer, contractor, constructor, product supplier. It applies to all of you, and it's coming your way if you haven't seen it yet. So we'll be talking about this and very few other things too. So who have I got with me today? I'll kind of move over here. So my name is Lewis Barlow. I'm that one over there. Technical Director at WSP with responsibility for decarbonization. And here I have Heleni Pantelidou from Arup, decarbonization lead. Yeah. Mimi, next to Heleni, Senior Carbon Management Consultant from Mott MacDonald. And finally, Lewis over there, Srengari, Principal ESG Consultant, Sustainable Finance Person from Arup also. So, quick bit of context. PAS 2080, I mentioned it already. What is it? Let's quickly get that out the way. Just to add a little bit of interaction into the thing as well. By a show of hands, has anyone heard of PAS 2080? Okay, probably about half. That's great. Okay. Anyone actually been involved in using it at all or working to it on a project? One? Less so? Okay, that's good. Well, don't worry. There will be more. If we did this time next year, there'd be more. I'm absolutely certain of that. But what is it? Okay, so PAS, publicly available specification 2080. 2080 is just a number, it's not a date. It's for managing carbon across the built environment. Originally, when it was published in 2016, it was focused on infrastructure. Now it's for buildings and infrastructure, and it defines this in the document itself. It defines what the built environment is. So basically, anything that you can construct and operate, this is relevant for. It stemmed from the Infrastructure Carbon Review in 2013, and that document looked at where all the carbon emissions were coming from in the UK. And it recognized that most carbon emissions come from infrastructure, either directly or indirectly. Okay, so infrastructure is a big issue if we're going to get to net zero in the UK and across the world. The Infrastructure Carbon Review recognized, on the one hand, that this is a massive problem, but on the other, there's no standard way of dealing with it across the built environment. So that's what led to PAS 2080. As I said, originally published in 2016, and now republished last year. So new and improved, and it's being specified and required by more and more clients across not just the UK, but worldwide. I was just speaking to some client organizations in Australia just yesterday, and the Australian government is starting to mandate PAS 2080. So one way or another, one direction or another, whether you're a local authority or private sector client, it's coming. It's the way to manage carbon. But what does it mean, and how is it? Why is it important for construction, particularly going forward? Well, I have a graph to show you, and Heleni will explain. I'll go forward straight to that, if that's okay. Over to you, Heleni, just to explain this one.
Okay,
right?
Yes, sorry. Thank you, Lewis. So, a bit of context to aid the discussion afterwards, please. So, when we talk about net zero, and I do recognize there are a few definitions out there of what net zero carbon looks like, we are talking about all sectors of the UK economy moving in a trajectory towards a very specific net zero by 2050. So the the residual carbon in the year 2050 and beyond is very small compared to now. And it affects sectors differently. Also, different sectors have progressed at different pace over the years. So this is just trying to guess who is in the audience and looking primarily at the sectors that are mostly represented here, which is power, transport, and buildings. So power is the good sector. You know, moving away from coal in the 90s was fantastic, has made really good progress. It still has a long way to go to get to a net zero economy. Surface transport and buildings are not so good. Generally speaking, there is an awful lot of carbon already locked in our built environment system. Most of our buildings are already here. Most of our transport network is already here. Even most of our energy network is already here. So there is this other thing of construction which we keep forgetting about, which again hasn't fared very well. Construction is traditionally a very conservative industry, an industry that is not liking change very much. The point is that if we go, Lewis, how do I go to the next slide? Sorry. You know, in the name of decarbonizing the UK economy, we are about to embark on the most incredible construction spree. 4 times as much, I don't know, as what we are used as an industry to provide. So, and this construction has to become decarbonized. So this is just a selection for food for thought of some of the projects that are currently in the pipeline and will be happening in the next 10, 15 years, sort of as a commitment for the UK transition to net zero. So how easy, what do we need to do as a supply chain, as the construction industry, built environment industry, to do this successfully? So that's opening to discussion.
Thank you, Lainey. Thank you. I should have said, you probably noticed that ICE is very prominent on these slides. That's my other hat. I'm the trustee for carbon and climate for the Institution of Civil Engineers, and ICE was kind of central in particularly republishing PAS 2080. So just drawing these strands together. And just to get a feel of sort of who's in the audience or sort of where you're coming from, really, PAS 2080 breaks stakeholders up into sort of 4 general categories. They're quite broad categories. There's clients and financiers and sort of people that are at the top of the project, sort of creating the projects. There's designers and constructors and product suppliers and material suppliers. So sort of 4 broad categories. And there's lots of crossovers between those categories. But I wonder, would you mind if you're a client or in that sort of financier category, would you put your hand up? Okay, great. There's a handful there. Thank you very much. What about designers and consultants and things like that? Great, okay. And contractors and people actually building, okay. And product suppliers and material suppliers. Okay, not so much around here. They're all at the stands at the moment, you know, selling stuff. Okay, that's great. We've got a broad spectrum of across there. Right, we're going to cover 3 very important aspects of all of this. One is how PAS 2080 and this whole approach applies not just on projects, but at a macro scale, at a system level. How can we bring that all together? What's that mean? So Mimi, I'll be asking you about that in a second. Also on the funding and the finance and how investors are starting to pay much more attention to the greenhouse gases and the carbon associated with construction and infrastructure projects. I'll be talking to Lewis about that. And finally, Helene and I will be discussing, amongst other things, the ability of the supply chain to cope with these new requirements. But let's start with you, Mimi, if that's okay. So PAS 2080 mentions the system, and people talk about system and systems, and it gets quite confusing sometimes. So I wonder if I could ask you to explain what is this system when it comes to PAS 2080, what's happening at the moment, and what do you think might happen next?
Absolutely, yeah, thank you, Lewis. Good afternoon, everyone. As a quick introduction, my name's Mimi Zimmer. I'm from Mott MacDonald. We're an engineering, management, and development consultancy, and we work across the built environment. I'm on our carbon management team, and was really pleased to be, along with my colleagues here today, one of the technical authors of the revision to PAS 2080. So, yeah, good to meet you all, and thank you for joining us. So I've been asked to speak about systems, which is definitely one of the big areas that was addressed in the revision to PAS 2080, and try try and bring that to life a little bit in more of sort of a practical example of what does this mean in practice? What does it mean to apply systems thinking in the built environment? So we talk a lot about systems thinking in the revision to the PAS, and the reason for that is that net zero is a systems level target, as Helene has said. We need to reach net zero across the economy, which is comprised of various different sectors, all of which have a unique emissions profile and unique levers to decarbonize and reduce those emissions. Those decarbonization measures are at different levels of technological maturity, they're at different levels of commercial deployment, different costs, different accessibility. And in addition to that, there are a lot of interdependencies within and between sectors as well. We talk a lot about this in, for example, the decarbonization of heat, the electrification of heat, the electrification of transport, what that is going to do in terms of demands on the power sector. But this is really true across the board, thinking about the example of water supply requirements for industrial decarbonization when it comes to hydrogen production, carbon capture and storage, et cetera. So I think one of the first points is that a net zero pathway requires different actions across different sectors, and those actions have different deadlines in order for the system to reach net zero by its target date. So a good example of this is in the power sector, as Helene was talking about earlier, that actually for a decarbonized and net zero system, the power sector needs to reach zero or near zero emissions actually a lot faster and a lot earlier than some other sectors of the economy. And then similarly in, for example, the land sector, the land use sector might need to deliver more removals than is technically necessarily required just to net off the land sector's emissions. So it's really about across the board, across different sectors, what is that sector's role in contributing to a net zero system? So in the PAS, we talk a lot about net zero alignment, and so not whether you are net zero within your specific asset boundary, but whether your asset and your project is contributing to what your sector needs to do in order to reach net zero. So it's sort of a practical example of where this might come up. This often comes up when we talk about sort of what good looks like for a project, when we talk about what is the reduction that it needs to achieve, what is the sort of allowable carbon, what is the limit on carbon that that project is able to use up. Historically, we do this as sort of savings relative to a counterfactual baseline, right? We think about what would we have built in the business as usual, how much carbon was associated with that, and now what are we going to do instead, and what's that saving? So I think what PAS has really challenged us to do in this systems thinking context is really look at, rather than that savings relative to the counterfactual, it's, okay, well for my sector, which my asset is a part of this network or this system, what does that sector need to do? And how can my project contribute to that? So looking at the pipeline example that Helene had up on screen just there, this is, really it's a question of, with that visibility over what is needing to be built, what is my project's role, what is my project's proportion of those emissions that would keep us sort of within an allowable limit for the net zero system. But this is quite challenging because we don't always know what other projects, what other outcomes is the sector going to need to deliver. We don't always have great sight over what other bars are there in that chart. And then equally, we don't always know for those projects how much carbon is going to be in those projects. So this is where I think we're really moving towards and where we need to be stepping more towards is this concept of, rather than, some sort of percentage reduction relative to this counterfactual, it's really looking at what system, what network is my asset a part of, and then how much, what's my contribution to that trajectory. So yeah, I think we'll probably pick up on some of that in discussion, but I'm probably at my time, so I'll hand back to you, Lewis. Yeah.
No, that's all right. You're just getting started. Well, just to sort of underline that, I mentioned PAS 2080 to, I won't say who, but sort of quite a prominent person in a transportation organization a couple of years ago. And I asked them if they'd heard of it, and they said, yeah, I know that. That's for engineers, isn't it? That's for engineers to choose the right steel and concrete. I was like, no, well, sort of. It's about that, but it's also about choosing the right project. It's about making decisions and adding everything up. So if everyone's following PAS 2080 across the board, then you can compare apples with apples at a governmental level. Certainly local authority level, network level, and system level, like putting it all together. I think the absolute ideal scenario would be past 2080 would be applied worldwide, and then we would really be able to add up things and line things up with net zero very intelligently. You've got to have something to hope for, don't you? Okay, well, maybe let's move to Lewis next, if that's okay. Let's think about money and cost. A central message of the Infrastructure Carbon Review in 2013 was reduce carbon, reduce cost. That's still a good rule of thumb for infrastructure, but it's much more complicated than that. Sometimes you have to pay more upfront to get the lowest carbon solution, and you have to weigh up carbon and cost and investments and all that sort of thing. So Lewis, how has carbon and greenhouse gases been accommodated or considered by investors perhaps in the past, and are things changing, and what's your view on all this?
Thank you, Luis. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Luis. I work at Arup, just as Helene. I sit in a team that provides ESG and sustainable investment advisory services for infrastructure and real estate investors. So we directly engage with them, bringing the technical skills and the technical knowledge of how we know that these kind of assets are planned, designed, operated, and built, and basically try to influence where they put the money. So essentially trying to put the money in the right place. That's essentially what I try to do as my job. So to answer your question, Luis, why GHG emissions or carbon emissions are important to investors. So what I'm seeing in the market clearly is for investors and for the people who will be, unlocking these projects to exist. Emissions means financed emissions. So if you have a company, if you have an infrastructure company or a real estate company as part of your portfolio, it means those emissions are your emissions in finance terms. So therefore, if you have any investment associated with carbon intensive activities, any risks associated with that will be also your risks. So that's the finance language to it. Whatever the risk is, policy, legal, technological, reputational, market risks, there are many risks out there associated with emissions. But that's essentially the essence of it. So that's how it's driving investment to actually account for emissions, not only in the way you manage your assets, your infrastructure systems, your real estate investment, from an operational perspective, from a financial perspective, commercial perspective, but also in the investment cycle, whether you invest in a new company considering that, or you exit, you divest from something because of the actual material emissions associated with that asset. So that's how I see emissions actually impacting the investment world. What I'm seeing as the main drivers, or what's happening essentially in the market, is first, the role of the investment community to actually drive change. I mean, obviously triggered by regulations, but actually responding to that and actually creating a cascade down effect, a domino effect in asset owners, designers, constructors, product material suppliers to actually make emissions as part of the business case. Not only emissions, but also other ESG metrics. But I guess the emissions is the most prominent one because it's quantifiable. You can compare apples to apples. You can benchmark things. So that's why it's picking up emissions is so relevant. And I think one of the key trends that is very much linked to what we're discussing here is that investors, especially in the European region, are moving from commitments to actually implementation. So now they actually need to demonstrate, report action, they need to report performance, they need to report results. So it's very much driven to the way they manage emission and drive change across their investment, across their portfolio. So that's a very hot topic right now, and we get engagements from different kinds of clients every single week, if not every day, on this topic specifically. There are really good examples out there. Like, I think the airport sector is, everyone talks about flights and emissions associated with that, but if you treat the airport as an asset in itself, there are really good carbon management interventions going on in that space, not only in the buildings in itself, the actual emissions associated with the airport, but also the fleet associated, providing alternative surface transport access to the airport, and different pricing mechanisms that they have, not only for the airlines, but also for the customers, users of that airport. So there are many things going on in this space that are all linked to the actual management of emission towards reduction and towards a commitment, a target, whatever that looks like. There are many other drivers, for example, in the renewable space, for example, which renewable in itself, it's a kind of the nature of it is good, right? Because you treat it as part of the transition. However, it's a big market. There's a lot of competition. You can see here around like loads of stands about heat pumps and other renewable solutions. So you need to find ways to differentiate your business so that actually investor buys in and you actually escalate that, right? And then one of the ways that we are actually advising very closely a few renewable companies is bringing those additional aspects of carbon management, so having proper governance, a proper leadership, a proper management systems to actually drive that as a decision metric, not only for the nature of the business, or we're zero emission, operational emission business, but across the whole chain, like where you're sourcing your solar panels, what are you doing at the end of life with your wind turbines and so on, as a differentiator for actual investors to put money into those businesses. So that's how I see the emissions and the carbon management assets basically influencing the investment community. Yep.
Thank you very much, Luis, and we will definitely come back and continue the conversation. Before I go to the sort of next subject, you probably got questions and thoughts in your mind. Store them up, because there's plenty of opportunity to cover that in about 10 minutes or so. Also, if you've got any questions at all about PAS 2080, this is the crack team right in front of you, live here, right now. So any questions at all about PAS 2080? Sorry, I know we didn't plan that, but I just think, you're here. So that's really important. Just an anecdote for me on the sort of financial side. So I've sort of, going ages ago when I started in my career, I looked at environmental risk for brownfield sites and ground engineering and things, and that was built on regulations and standards and ways of doing things that were all sort of emerging, and eventually they got there, and that was the control. You had sort of regulations over things, and that will come with carbon, no doubt, but there's also probably just as important, even more important, is the economic drivers and the financing side. And it was about 5 years ago, I won't say which pension company it was, but I went to see a very large pension company to talk to them about carbon and decarbonization and how were they considering carbon in their investments. And I can say this truthfully because I'm not mentioning the organization, but they said, look, carbon's important to us, decarbon's important to me and my family and all that, but we just go where the money is, so we're still investing in coal and we're still doing all that because that's where the money is and that's what we do, and we've got to just think about our pension fund. And that changed massively. That same pension fund has changed its outlook completely. They realized that fossil fuels there's not money in fossil fuels in the future. Pension funds are a good way of looking at this because they're looking decades into the future and they see the money, they see it as being toxic. So yeah, things are definitely changing. Okay, to Helene, this is a question about supply chains. So there's a lot more onus on decarbonizing in various different senses, but particularly felt at the product suppliers, material suppliers end. What's your feelings on this? Is the supply chain ready for this?
So the short answer is no. And there is a very good reason for that. So part of the reason why we felt it necessary to revise PAS 2080 was to bring it in line with what we have observed across the industry happening time and again. This business of delegating the carbon doing down the value chain. So clients buy in, or pension funds buy into this, they delegate to the asset owners. The asset owners write contracts that ask for carbon reduction. They pass it on to the designers, the contractors, and the contractors, of course, say, supply chain provide. Suppliers, we need all your innovative materials. But by the way, we need it to be at lowest cost, quickest program, and without any risk. So there is a thing there which is very important for all of us to own up to and realize. So Mimi's talked about systems. That's so important. your asset is a cog in the decarbonization of the infrastructure network and system that we're dealing with. There is no separate budget for decarbonizing business as usual. We are feeling it through and through the UK and potentially the world. So back to the pipeline of projects are the ones that are actually going to deliver in the best way possible decarbonization. And that's how we need to prioritize them. Investment talks. So therefore, and there are a lot of similarities, something I should have said here. There is a lot of similarities of carbon as a currency with money. So in order to get our economy to be net zero operating, we need to have an awful lot of capital carbon investment. If the two do not add up to something that is aligning with a 1.5 or maybe 2 degrees of average climate, average temperature increase, then we have failed. So capital carbon investment is what the supply chain should address. Everybody's talking about innovation. The next wonderful zero carbon concrete and steel is going to appear anytime soon. Innovation is really disruption of our risk-averse industry. So we have two options. Either we disrupt ourselves, and we know how difficult this is, or we let someone else disrupt us because the investors have scaled up the ask. So that's the first difficult bit. How do we deal with innovation organically within our industry, and quickly, by the way? Time is of essence. There is an awful lot of risk associated with innovation. There isn't such a thing as, commonly asked, may I add, please provide us some innovative solutions and also some previous examples of where this has worked. So we do need to have the pilot projects across the supply chain that are going to demonstrate suitability. They do not exist at any reasonable extent. And then the third point is, very importantly, scaling up at the time and pace required. You cannot expect the poor supply chain, who have been trained to live through boom and bust at regular intervals, to somehow provide this nirvana zero carbon construction. So value chain is something we repeatedly talked about in PAS 2080. Collaborative approach to decarbonizing also includes how does clients, investors, dare I say, but also designers and constructors come together to enable, both incentivize, but also enable innovation and, so the supply of these circular construction materials, technologically new construction materials and techniques to be available there with optimized risk and managing risk appropriately. So 3 things: disruption, risk sharing, and scaling up. If we can master that, yes, the supply chain can deliver.
Thank you. Okay, that sounds really quite easy. Okay. Just again to add to that, again, the word challenge is in the new PAS 2080 almost 20 times, and that's unheard of for a specification like that. You wouldn't expect to be encouraged to challenge things, but that's what PAS 2080 does. It's encouraging almost everyone to challenge each other, hopefully in a way that you don't annoy everyone enough so that they don't want to employ you, but you're challenging the system ultimately and saying that the way we're doing things is actually unsustainable. And one form of challenge, I helped some contractors a couple of years ago because they were getting challenged by the client to sort of solve the problem. You know, this sort of, like you're saying, Helene, the sort of mantra went all the way from the top of the project, right, and it ended up right down to the product suppliers saying, right, you've got to reduce all the carbon. And they were like, well, okay, and then they worked it out, and there was, well, we can do that a bit, but if you want to really go low, it's going to cost more. And then that sort of challenge starts to go back up the supply chain, which leads to procurement. And I just wanted to drop in that the new PAS has a new clause, a new section on procurement, because that's really important to really contractually link it all up from the client all the way up and down the supply chain so that carbon's a quantifiable differentiating factor in who's doing what. Okay, right, some really interesting things we've talked about so far. I wonder if this is a good time to throw it towards the audience. If you've got any points or questions, you can stick your hand up, and there's a roving microphone. And then, oh, great, there's a gentleman over here with the glasses. Yeah.
Hi, this is very useful and many thanks for the overview. I just had a quick question, not sure if this has been considered at some point during the discussion, but does getting the PAS 2080 accreditation adds or enhances the value of the infrastructure project? Is that something, because that talks to the money, that's why. But feel free to not answer or just, yeah, thanks.
Helene, you want to go for that?
I'm happy to answer. So what it does, it helps ourselves, all of us, get organized and talk the same language, be comfortable to have the same sort of processes and tools and thinking and governance so that we can deliver low carbon construction or infrastructure systems or built environment in general. Just having the accreditation doesn't do the job. You have to act on it. And by the way, you know, certification is not obligatory. I mean, there is an option in PAS to do self-certification and so on. So it is more difficult to discipline an organization on self-certification, which is why I think what you're referring to, there is a requirement more and more by asset owners to have a supply chain that is certified. But you can do it yourself. If you can, sorry, I'm not going to say what is right is wrong. It does help get ourselves organized and making sure we have the right approach and we don't just pay lip service to decarbonization and carbon management and so on. So does that answer your question?
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
Playing a bit devil's advocate. So if I was pitching this to an investor, they would probably ask me, okay, what's the monetary value? So if I have a stamp there, this is PAS 2080 certified, what gain? What's my gain? How much can I increase something? I got this already, for example, for LEED BREEAM certification, especially for commercial buildings. There is already a business case, certainly for residential buildings because of the landlord-tenant situation. Commercial buildings is a bit different, and I have been challenged a few times already in the sense of, okay, show me a few numbers of how much effort I should be putting here to actually get value out of the door. I think the benefit of the PAS accreditation, actually driven by procurement, is the golden key. I think that's why procurement is so important. And we're seeing clients asking for this thing. So asking for accreditation, PAS 2080 accredited organization to ensure that you can deliver within the criteria, the brief that they have allocated. So ensuring that you can deliver a sustainable infrastructure following a carbon management process. So I think that's the most benefit, because then you can get into bids, you can get into, actually win work, especially me from a designer perspective, consultancy firm. That's, I think, the biggest benefit. But yeah, hopefully that helped a bit more. But yeah.
I'll just add a tiny bit to that as well. I see we said it, or I said it at least, even after the first PAS 2080, that accreditation shouldn't delay or inhibit your application of what's in PAS 2080. You can get on with that anyway. Accreditation is great, but there's parallels between accreditation of an organization and full, proper LCA EPD certification for your product. That's the holy grail. Everyone will be certified. Doesn't mean to say that you will, the other thing to consider is alignment. Alignment, your accreditation, but you even if you're not there yet, due to a lack of certifiers, lack of auditors, or whatever it is, you at least need to get an understanding of your alignment and your maturity with respect to your PAS 2080 requirements.
If I may, just very quickly, one last point on that is that both the PAS and the guidance document are freely available for industry to use. That was exactly one of the goals of this revision, was to just reduce all barriers to organizations beginning to implement these processes. So yeah, just probably worth mentioning that as well. Please go go check out the specification and the guidance, because industry really came together to make it freely accessible so that we could accelerate as much as possible.
That's such a good point. It's free. It's free. Any more? There's a point over there. I'm going to actually get the PAS thing back on there because there's a QR code and you can download it for free straight away. Gentleman over there. Yep.
Hiya, how's it going? Right, that's a very convincing presentation. Thanks very much. I come from a different kind of view on it to an extent, even though I'm involved in this for work-wise. But personally, I was trying to kind of sort out some kind of PAS stuff with work to try and get them on some kind of sustainability track. But then I thought I'll ask them about, could you have a PAS 2080 that related to your own personal life? Because to me, I find it a little bit frustrating that as time's gone on, there are more and more people on the bandwagon talking about, for obvious reasons, but talking about sustainability, but they themselves are usually on quite decent salaries and are using an enormous amount of carbon themselves. And I don't know what the panel's carbon footprint is. I know what mine is roughly, but we're supposed to be coming down to about 2. And the thing that kind of also worries me is when you're kind of semi-greenwashing when you're saying, right, we've got investors who will invest in air travel because an electric car will get you there or something, or the electric lights are produced by solar panels. But ultimately, we shouldn't be going on flights to, our rugby club goes on a flight to the Bahamas, and then, might rest of the year think themselves quite green because they're going through the PAS 80 at work or something.
Okay, so who wants to take this one?
I could go on forever.
I know, it's okay. Can PAS 2080 be applied to individuals, and what's all that about?
I would say PAS 2080 is the individual. The principles still apply, but it's a bit of an overkill, checking whether I'm managing my household against it. It's perfectly valid. I think your point is, the greenwashing bit, and I agree with you 100%. Don't choose which carbon you're going to talk about. So allowing your personal behaviors with what you're professing to be doing. And it's all work in progress. I was going to jump up and say, I cycle to work every day. I don't take electric cars or even public transport. But my footprint may not be as low as I could. What this is about, this is meant to be about, we know we need to change our behaviors, and there's a limit to how much own production of vegetables I can do in my vegetable batch in central London. I'm afraid that, or North London better. We are constrained by, to a certain extent. It's not an excuse, but it is part of the problem, that the way we have set up our built environment also dictates our behaviors. So at the moment, partly for cultural reasons, which I think you're alluding to, partly convenience, time, we haven't had time to think it over. It's probably easier to get to your private car, even if it's electric, it's still more carbon consuming than walking, cycling, or getting on the train. So, and partly is because the setup of our infrastructure, our systems, back to systems, make it dictate the behaviors to a certain extent. You should still think as an individual, but at the moment we cannot get to anywhere near 2050 net zero by expecting everybody will be educated and start behaving responsibly individually. We also have to provide the setup, you know, we're no longer building roads to increase capacity. We are building roads to, if we are still building roads, to decarbonize the transport system. That's a very different project.
We've just got time for one more question, I think. If get the gentleman at the back. Thanks, Helene.
Hi. Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question, or I would love to hear a comment about sustainability and carbon today is quite siloed in most types of projects and in the construction industry, which sort of means there's a sustainability consultant usually doing all of the work. And things like Past 2080 is great because it gives us a framework. But to me, it seems like the current way of doing things doesn't really scale to do at the entire industry. So you can't have an external team always doing carbon assessments. I'm wondering what your comments are around which stakeholders are actually involved and which stakeholders should be involved in this new, let's say, future format of the industry, which needs to track and manage carbon throughout a project's life cycle and not just, you know, to tick a box at the end of the project.
My favorite question. Can I jump in very quickly? So, we're trying to ban carbon specialists, if that's possible, okay? The motto for the revised Past 2080 is integrate decarbonization into decision making. A sustainability consultant, they're brilliant. They want the best thing in the world. They have made it their profession. But they cannot come up with solutions. Their profession is about accounting, not necessarily about implementing. So I'm a civil engineer and decided to move into this space because I can offer solutions. I can think solutions needed. So sustainability is a catch-all, and we need to move away. It has to be our second nature.
And I think in addition to the point about integrating carbon into decision making, it also goes the other way of integrating into our carbon assessment process these other really important considerations. So one of the things the PAS does is talks about the importance of nature-based solutions. It talks about the importance of resilience and actually building resilience requirements into your carbon budget so that you know what those requirements are and you're planning for it. So it's both bringing carbon out of this carbon silo and across the organization so that it's integrated into decision making, but also integrating other things into the way we make decisions about carbon. So really trying to have that go both ways. I don't know if Lucy wants to-
Last point. One of the key things in this update is recognizing the ability of some stakeholders to actually control and influence something compared to others. And I think that's a key thing when delivering any infrastructure or buildings project. So it's recognizing the role that an asset owner, the asset manager, the clients in a room have to actually create that cascade down effect. That's why I actually moved into the investor space, essentially I'm a civil engineer by training as well, and I recognize exactly the issue that you identify. I've done whole life carbon assessment in many projects, but many times didn't go anywhere. So my move was essentially that, basically trying to influence top of the chain, because those stakeholders have the greatest ability. They're not the only one who can do something, but they are the ones with greatest ability to influence the brief, influence the requirement, influence the procurement, and so on. And that creates a domino effect, as I was alluding to.
Thank you. I'll just wrap up now because I think we've just got a few minutes left. On that point, though, I just got a couple of anecdotes. Quick one. My previous company, which will remain nameless, which was very good, but it was my previous company, I always got a lot of pressure. Oh, why are you not growing the carbon team? The carbon team's got to grow. There should be more people in the carbon team. And I was always like, no, the carbon team should be small. The carbon work will grow across an organization, but it should be getting done with the people that are actually, making decisions about what they're actually, just as you say. The other thing, I think I picked up on your question, what's going to sort of coordinate all of this, all, beyond the project? Maybe I've got a hope it's government. Government as well. I live in Scotland. The Scottish government is it's in the draft statutory guidance under the Climate Change Act. PAS 2080 is in there. as well as NPF4, planning framework. PAS 2080 will be in there. Now, it hasn't sorted itself out yet, but the logical extension of all of that is that the government will be recording, reporting, assessing, assimilating all the stuff that's getting done across the country under PAS 2080 or PAS 2080 type stuff. And that's going to be the way that they can line up what they're doing with the trajectory towards net zero in a practical way. So I think governmental organizations, whether it's local authorities, well, local authorities first, Department for Transport, central government, they will hold the key to all that. Right, I just have a couple of things to sort of final points there. So decarbonisation must be integrated into the business cases and delivery for infrastructure and buildings, taking guidance from the newly updated PAS 2080. Focus on no regrets choices for capital investment, considering carbon and costs. Scale up and implement low carbon innovations, mature and ready. And more consideration is required for carbon budgets and compatibility with the required service outcomes at a system level. How much carbon actually do we have left to spend if we're going to get to net zero, and how do we best spend it? Okay, thank you very much for your attention. If you've got any questions about PAS 2080, I think we'll probably be hovering around for a bit after this, but also get in touch. You know, whatever it is, the aim is to share this information and for everyone to be doing it consistently. Thank you.